Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président, cher Didier Kling. Et maintenant, sans plus attendre, je vous propose que nous démarrions notre forum sur les Global Cities avec le témoignage très précieux, et je tiens à la remercier de nous faire l'honneur de sa visite. Elle est arrivée hier soir tard à Paris, exprès pour l'événement, Madame Saskia Sassen, professeure à l'Université de Columbia, et qui a été la première à introduire le concept des Global Cities par un ouvrage qui nous a à tous servi de référence. Saskia, c'est à vous.
Alors, c'est un grand plaisir d'être ici avec vous et aussi parce... Ah oui, bien, très bien. Anything else? Yes, that mic works, okay. Alors, je commence en français pour 2 minutes seulement. Et après, je tourne à l'anglais parce que c'est beaucoup plus efficace pour moi de parler en anglais. Et je crois que tout le monde ici parle anglais, probablement. Alors, so the global city, way back when, in the 1980s, in the West, much less so, say, in China, the notion was, if we remember, that cities were becoming useless because we had digital information, digital capabilities. There was a very strong belief that cities no longer mattered. A second element that fed that notion is my English clear? I speak English like a foreigner, by the way, so they understand me much better than your typical Brit. Ununderstandable, the Brits, as you probably have experienced. I love them, though, so no problem there. So when I started to do this work, a lot of firms, and I think that was also happening on the continent here, were leaving cities. Cities were fairly poor. We have forgotten that in many ways. Cities were struggling to keep people. You had all kinds of new modalities, big corporations that located a bit outside the center of the city. There was a very strong notion that cities no longer mattered for the core, the key sectors of our economies. And I was doing my research in New York City, always a very messy kind of city, not at all like Paris. Things are always falling apart there. And I noticed that there was it was like a whole new economy of small, highly specialized firms that was installing itself in New York, and then of course also in other cities. In London, you know, I did quite a bit of research on that in several countries. And this was an economy that I call an intermediation economy. Intermediate. Number one, they need each other, highly specialized legal knowledge about what it means to invest in Mongolia, in Argentina, in Chile, whatever. Very specialized. And these firms needed each other, and they still do, by the way. And so out of that comes a kind of new economy that installs itself in our cities, and that marks this new epoch. A lot of entities left cities, and again, I remind you, New York City was officially broke. New York City always number one in these matters. It was bankrupt. Paris was poorish. London was poor. So there were a whole bunch of cities, major cities, that had lost. Why? An epoch had ended. A new epoch was emergent, but it was difficult to detect it. So as I was doing my research, I noticed that a new type of economy was installing itself in these cities. And it was highly specialized, so specialized, like they could deliver goods, as I just said, you know, goods knowledge functions, for whatever country you needed. But that level of specialization means that you have to be networked. You cannot support a firm that just does specialized knowledge on Mongolia. It just doesn't work that way. You need the lawyering, you need the knowledge of what are the economic sectors that are growing, what are the challenges, et cetera, et cetera. And it is in that setting that this notion of the global city actually begins to make sense. You know, that there was the need for highly networked sectors. The big corporates could leave. They could go anywhere. But what they needed, if they were going to operate globally, was access to all the specialized, the lawyering, the accounting, the investment preferences, etc., etc. So this is an extraordinary transformation. And the visuals were that, oh my God, the big corporations are leaving, the cities are finished when it comes to leading economic sectors. What they couldn't see was this whole new economy. And just to give you just a taste of what it meant to do research at that point, I remember, I'm pretty short, huh? So I was at some meeting with enormously tall men, all planners who thought they knew what was happening in New York. I'm letting them have it right now when I speak like this. And so I went up to them and I said, look, all those big empty buildings, they look so empty, but I think there's something happening inside of this. This is Wall Street, if I can help you imagine that, right? Wall Street. And they looked at me and laughed and said, well, you can go to Wall Street at night. During the day, Wall Street is ours. These were researchers, huh? They were planners and researchers. These were not people who were actually working on Wall Street. And so I said, good idea, I'm going to do that. And I went at night. I went at midnight to have lunch, as they say, with the cleaners. And the cleaners go anywhere. They have to clean everything. They respect every space, but they know what's happening in those firms. And so I took my sandwich, and at midnight I was there sitting in some space with the cleaners, eating my sandwich with them. And then I said, but for whom are you cleaning? This is how my global city notion emerged, I want you to understand. And then they said, we'll show you. And they showed me, dozens in this big hulky building that had once been a big bank or something like that, or insurance company. And there were all kinds of small specialized, beautiful boutique style operations, including Goldman Sachs, which at that point was little. And they said, this is what the new economy is in here. Well, they didn't use that language. But that, to me, that was so interesting. The experts on the city were saying cities are finished for leading sectors. The cleaners understood that a new economy was being born there. And so out of that comes the global city function. Now, second critical element that I think always needs clarification, the global city function at its narrowest, in its narrowest meaning, which also is the sharpest meaning, the meaning more difficult to understand than simply, the global city. I just came from Dubai, and so there everybody talked global city. It was absolutely extraordinary. And the professor in me, the researcher, cannot but make sure that they understand that cities have many elements in them. The global city function is one key element. It's a very dominant element. But there are many parts of all our major cities, our most international cities, that are local. The locality remains extremely important. Now, if I think of 1, 2, or 3 elements that sort of mark this emergent new condition that we then call the global city, one of them is what I also already indicated, hi there, is that no global enterprise, an enterprise that is really operating throughout the world, can do all the knowledge functions in this type of economy, and this is now a story of 30 years at least, in-house. It needs an intermediate sector. What marks the new type of wealth, the new type of power, the new type of intelligences and knowledges, the high valuations that rise, is a networked sector. It is not simply the old traditional big enterprises. They were dominant up till the 1980s. When we privatize, deregulate, and globalize our economies, each one of those 3 is partial. None is total. It's certain elements that get privatized, certain elements that get globalized. When that begins to happen, that is when these big corporations, the big enterprises, they can go anywhere. But what they need is an extraordinarily interconnected intermediate sector, because that will deliver you the 28 hours of Mongolian accounting and the 15 hours of I don't know what, whatever you need. You can buy whatever you need. That, the heart of our current economies, and it has been like that for 30 years, is that extraordinarily networked, they need each other, partial knowledges, but knowledges about anything and everything in the world. What do the Mongolians prefer? What do the Argentinians dislike, etc.? Do they want, all of these modalities? And that is in its sort of sharpest version, if you want, this notion of the global city. Now I notice, footnote, I don't see a clock. So I have to be alerted. Will you be my guiding master here and tell me how much more time I have, because otherwise. Now, a second element that sort of marks the global city is, of course, that ironically, so digitized, so globalized, so rich, so powerful, each of those major sectors have those features. And yet, it needs urban material space. When you go back 30 years or so, the notion was, if it's digital and you are a rich firm, you don't need all of that. You don't need the city. And that is the big error that emerges in the 1980s, when the digital comes up and the global comes up. This notion that space, particular kinds of concentrated, localized, and where, that doesn't matter. And the irony, if I look at New York City, if I look at London, I don't dare to speak about Paris when I'm speaking in Paris. If I were speaking in Dubai, where I did yesterday, I did speak about Paris, but I'm not going to speak about Paris with this audience. That would be a mistake. But what happens is a vast expansion, and the financial centers are a good example. The financial centers, algorithmic mathematics, this is no longer economics, this is another domain. And powerful, rich, etc., they have taken over more and more urban space in major cities in the last 30 years than they did in earlier periods. Why? What is it about this type of economy that means that even the most digitized sector, the richest, the most powerful, the most international, the one for whom law does not fully operate, let's remember that we cannot at this stage fully govern high finance. And again, high finance is not economics in the traditional sense of the term. High finance is algorithmic mathematics. When you walk into Goldman Sachs, where before there were 100 secretaries, guess what? Today there are 100 physicists. And I'm not blaming the physicists for anything here. They develop these instruments that if you look at them, often 10, 15 complex steps. I did one particular study where I looked at the so-called the big financial crises that took place in New York City that destroyed 15 million households. There was an equivalent thing also with financial firms, but the households are simpler. 14.5 million, to be precise, households. I can't read the sign. Tell me how much time. 10 minutes? Perfect. So just to give you an example of what we are speaking about here, and again, I think that France has managed better than the UK and the US, some of these negative impacts, if you want. So back to those 14.5 million households. Those 14.5 million households were visited by banking experts who said, you can, and clearly these were poor people because most people still in the United States own a house. That is going to change, but for now it is that. These people were told, you can own your house. Just sign. All we need is your signature. You don't have to pay anything. In 7 years, 14.5 million such contracts were signed. You make an image of this. It's battalions of people spreading out. and going to these people who did not own houses and say, all you have to do is sign. Out of that comes the 2008 crisis, the big crisis that often gets very fancy language. It was a very elementary operation that did that. Now, what was happening here? This is the first clear instance at a mass scale that we have about this new type of economics, which is really algorithmic math. Okay? So what we saw as the little houses, what people who signed on those documents thought, this is all about my little house. No. The little house, basically via algorithmic mathematics, is transformed into a field, a whole mountain of material stuff, a door, a ceiling, doesn't matter what. That is what that was about. And the eye see the buildings, the little house, the big house, whatever. The reality is, with several steps, and that is why algorithmic mathematics, which is an admirable form of knowledge, by the way, that I use a lot, but that also is extremely powerful in ways that are invisible. It's not like plain old. Now, this was a catastrophic event. It also entered Europe. I think France was far less affected than Germany and then Hungary and then countries like that. But this shows an extraordinarily powerful instrument, brilliant forms of knowledge that winds up being rather destructive. I mean, it was really a major crisis. Today, we have a new form of this in Manhattan. Big luxury towers in Manhattan, not in New York City generally, but in Manhattan, empty. I don't know if any of you have seen. We're not talking a vast number, we're talking a few towers, but big fancy towers. The notion is, oh my God, the investment went wrong. We see it also in Milano. I'm sure we see it in Paris. I don't dare to talk about Paris here, so but I'll leave that open. We see it in quite a few places. Those empty buildings, we're talking big luxury buildings, they are providing more income or profit than if they were occupied. How? This is the grand version of what I described about the 14.5 million mostly small houses. These buildings are functioning as resources, as assets, but they are made generic via algorithmic mathematics. And again, I absolutely respect that kind of intelligence that is entailed in algorithmic mathematics. But an empty luxury tower in Manhattan and in London can produce more income than if it's occupied. Why? Because what we see as the building is actually transformed into a field of assets, you know, a door, a toilet, blah, and then you can take it and generate an asset-backed security at a time when the high investment circuit in the United States for sure and in the UK does no longer want certain types of instruments. They don't want derivatives. The derivatives are for the poorish people like me. I don't have derivatives, by the way, but anyhow, you know, that's the image. The high investment circuit, US and London, New York, Chicago, London, wants asset-backed securities. How do you generate assets when everything is financialized? Well, you start to financialize more and more stuff. So now they're financializing buildings, So this is an extraordinary turn of events. And I have to conclude, regrettably, because I wanted to say more, but this confronts your average modest investor with a real nasty situation. The high investment circuit knows what they want. They want assets. They don't want derivatives. The derivatives are for us. The derivatives by now have such long chains, because remember, they derive their value from, that every now and then, for instance, you will hear that 14 municipal governments in Italy, small towns, all went broke at the same time. They thought they had gotten a loan. No, they had gotten a derivative. And those are derivatives that then spread around to many, many municipal governments. Now, the first instance of this happened in the United States with Orange County. I don't know how many of you know this. And that was like 25 years back. This rich community, Orange County in California, suddenly goes broke, just like that. Said, we went broke? What happened? It was they had bought a derivative rather than having a regular loan. Now, I don't know if this is happening in France. I know a bit, but I don't know enough. But this is an alarming juxtaposition of brilliant minds. I truly respect the people who construct these algorithmic instruments. They're physicists, you know. This is way past economics, certainly not microeconomics. But at the same time, it's very alarming, the potentialities that are being engendered and the impossibility of our law and other modes of regulation to actually regulate. And to me, this is one major challenge that we need to face. And cities are really the beating heart of that kind of element. So I hope perhaps there is time for some questions, if you have questions. My purpose here was to say how cities really are also at risk with some of the most brilliant and highly admirable instruments that have been developed over this last, really over the last decade or so. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, dear Professor Sassen, dear Saskia, for this very inspiring talk. It was a great privilege for us all to hear you today and to benefit from your vision and your perspective about the global cities and what are the opportunities and the threats ahead for us. Professor Sassen kindly asked if there's any questions from the room. Perhaps we have time for one or two, and then Jacques Paquet, the chief editor of the Journal du Grand Paris, will start hosting our first roundtable. But before, did anyone wanted to ask something special to Professor Sassen? Well, no one dares, dear Saskia. Perhaps a round of coffee at... oh, sorry. Le jeune homme qui lève la main.
Good morning, Mrs. Sassen. I'm Julien Sakharovich. I was one of your students in 1998. I don't you know? Well, I attended some of your classes as an exchange student. No. So I wanted you to explain to me, because I'm working in promotion, in development, and I wanted you to depend the fact that an empty tower can be more expensive than an occupied tower. And I think my reaction is it's a short-term view, because in the end the asset is going to be occupied and its value is going to be in the end something worth. So I wanted you to just a few more words about that.
No, of course, and it is why I said it's just a few buildings. What we don't know now is what comes next, right? But this is really the brilliance of a mode of developing instruments, algorithmic mathematics, that makes that possible, you see, because the asset is not the building. The asset is the dismantling of that building via many complex steps into a mountain of materialities, or assets, if you want. We see the building, but the systemics involved actually have created, you don't buy a building, you buy an asset-backed security that you extract from a mountain of materialities. And so what is being financialized in that mode right now is a very broad range of items, including very modest housing, but you need millions then for it to work. This is, on the one hand, brilliant, innovative, It has nothing to do with microeconomics, nothing, zero microeconomics. And I always say, this is really not economics as we know it. This is something else. But that has also meant that from the urban perspective, this is a negative. You don't want empty towers. I don't know if anybody has seen them. I have slides where I show these empty buildings. They're very famous buildings, this building, that building, empty. And the notion of the general public is, oh, poor owners. In fact, no, because it is this other modality, and that is what this algorithmic mode enables. And really, we're talking about, they're all physicists. Huh? The people who are doing this, they are not economists. It's a totally different form of knowledge. I think, I'm at risk of talking too much, so maybe I hope we can talk more about it later.